News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat.
And a very good evening to you and welcome to Newsline Live tonight using Zoom. And our guest is also by Zoom and she's joining us from Singapore. Thank you very much. Now then, let me introduce our guest tonight is Dr. Chulanee Attanayake, who is a research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, the National University of Singapore. Also the author of China in Sri Lanka, published in 2013, and most recently Maritime Sri Lanka. Very good evening to you, Dr. Attanayake, and welcome to Newsline on Zoom.
Good evening, Faraz. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, of course, I'd like to ask you, the title tonight of our program is Geopolitics and How Fares Sri Lanka. So what I'd like to ask you really is, would you mind telling our listeners, our viewers, what all the fuss is about? Because a vessel is turning up at the Hambantota International Port. So what's the fuss?
I think you answered your question when you introduced the title itself. It's because of the geopolitics. We are an island nation sitting at the center of 21st century geopolitics. We are fortunate because of that, but that itself is the biggest challenge for Sri Lanka. So every country wants Sri Lanka in their strategic orbit because Sri Lanka is sitting in this enviable geographical location. Because of that, every country watches what the other countries are doing. So they have their own strategic competitions, own conflict. Sri Lanka willingly or unwillingly get dragged into this. So the fuss is basically about the geopolitics. And
but why particularly are our beloved and closest neighbor, the superpower India, why is India getting so upset just because the Yuan Wang 5 satellite tracking vessel is calling in at the Hambantota International Port? Surely there is no war situation, and we presume that they have asked this in good faith, and permission has been granted in good faith, because, again, presumably, this is an innocent passage, which is allowed under maritime law, isn't it?
Correct. I think from Sri Lanka's perspective, we have allowed this ship to come based on international law. It's through innocent passage. This is not a problem directly for Sri Lanka, but definitely it is a concern for India because of several reasons. One, China is India's biggest strategic competitor in the Indian Ocean region and in the world itself. Number two, it shares a border with China, and they are in a conflict which has been going on for decades. And recently there has been several flashes that happened, if you remember the incidents in 2020, etc. So they are increasingly in each other's throats all the time, if I may say so. And India definitely considers Sri Lanka as its strategic underbelly. We are one of the closest neighbors. And if I remember correctly, in one of the books by former ambassador to Sri Lanka, but also a national security advisor, Ambassador Shiv Shankar Menon, India sees Sri Lanka as a floating air dock for China. So this, I think, explains their strategic concern when it comes to Sri Lanka. So whatever China does in Sri Lanka is of greater concern for India. On the other hand, for the Indian media, this is an extremely sensationalized topic when it comes to anything to do with China, whether it's in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Nepal, anywhere else. So they tend to make a lot of noise when things like this is happening. So for them, it's a strategic security concern. It's a strategic interest. So they are closely observing what this ship is doing, what's its capacity, and how long it will be in Sri Lanka, etc., etc. Because Sri Lanka is a close neighbor, and we are in this geographical location, we get dragged into this conversation.
And Dr. Attanayake, can I ask you this? Sri Lanka is currently, as I think the entire world knows now, thanks to the ratings agencies and so on, Sri Lanka is undergoing some, shall we say, economic challenges of some grave proportion. Amidst all that, never has it been more important for Sri Lanka to be well and truly non-aligned, so that friends with everyone, enemies with none. And in that context, do you think, I pose it to you, do you think that it's rather unfair, not only from India but also from China, to put this tiny democratic nation, non-aligned, completely put it out and say, look, we want to come there, and the other guy says, no, but we don't want them to come. So isn't it rather unfair that Sri Lanka finds itself in such a predicament?
Well, this is an interesting time period for Sri Lanka and also a tricky time. So in terms of the ship's arrival, I do not think that this is something that happened overnight. Usually these kind of trips are planned a year ahead, and there are diplomatic protocols to follow after such a trip is planned. So I'm sure this has been in conversation. The authorities must have been in conversation with regard to this for a longer period of time. So, and then, as you rightly mentioned, because Sri Lanka is in a tricky economic situation, we get a lot of attention as well. Every country in politics have their interests. So whether a country is small or big, they tend to realize their interests. So in this situation, from a Sri Lankan perspective, yes, it is perhaps unfair for them to put Sri Lanka on the spotlight in their geopolitical game. But I don't think they would see it that way, because that's exactly their national interest and strategic interest.
And Dr. Attanayake, tell me, how does other countries, including India, how do they cope with this Chinese sort of resource-based diplomacy?
Well, I think every country face it differently. That depends on several factors. One, their need for such resources. Number two, where they are geographically located, and what their equation with China. For instance, if you look at Southeast Asia, East Asian countries, their equation with China is very different to that of South Asia. So for them, China is their neighbor, and they see China as a hegemonic power. So the way they approach China and to China's resource diplomacy is different to how the South Asian countries approach to China's resource diplomacy. For us, China is considered as an economic provider, not just for Sri Lanka, but also for other countries like Bangladesh, Nepal. And also a strategic balancer, because we are sitting closer to a bigger neighbor who is more powerful in every aspect, geographically, economically, strategically. Because of that, usually small countries tend to bring a balancer to the equation in order to manage the pressure from its powerful neighbor. So in that way, we cannot say that every country look at China's resource diplomacy the same way. And also, when it comes to the need of the countries, every country has, again, different equations when it comes to their infrastructure needs, where they can find the required funding. For instance, lower income country has the option to get more financial aid at a concessional rate from multilateral organizations compared to a middle income country. So because of these reasons, the way that every country approach China in terms of resource diplomacy is very different.
Thank you. And how did Sri Lanka sort of move away from, let's call it the Bandaranaike era of non-aligned policy, foreign policy? How did Sri Lanka find itself so much closer to China, much, I suppose, to the dismay of the West?
For us, I think it's the Sri Lanka's closeness, this level of closeness to China is relatively a new development. It started only in early 2000s. In my observation, at least, this is a development culminated by several factors. Some are unique to Sri Lanka's domestic conditions. Some are unique to China's development. So in early 2000s, we see China developing at double-digit rates, and it had huge surplus that could be invested in other countries. At the same time, China gained a membership at WTO, so it expanded its capacity to invest and go and as a creditor to provide loans, development aids for other countries. When this happens, in Sri Lanka, we finished a war against the terrorism, and as a result of that, there were some disagreements, I would say, with the West. There were allegations against the way Sri Lanka handled the entire conflict, as a result of which Sri Lanka's traditional donors sort of took a step back from coming forward to provide necessary financial aid to Sri Lanka at the time. Secondly, Sri Lanka also graduated to a middle-income country. So when that happens, usually the concessional loans coming from multilateral agencies declines. And the other important factor, I think, that happened during this period is the financial crisis in the West. With that, the West also did not have enough finances to invest elsewhere because it was dealing on its own about the problem they are facing. So this opened an opportunity for China to invest in Sri Lanka. There was a need from Sri Lanka's side, especially in terms of infrastructure. Usually, not every country would be ready to provide bilateral financing for infrastructure, but China has a different system where the companies are usually state-owned and they are driven by the state policies. So all these things culminated and matched together so that Sri Lanka had developed this strong tilt towards China.
And Newsline tonight is by Zoom, and we are delighted to have our guest, Dr. Chulanee Attanayake, who is a research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore, joining us live by Zoom all the way in Singapore. Let's go for a quick break, Dr. Attanayake, and we'll be back after this short message and a quick peek at this evening's headlines from the wonderful News First primetime news team. We'll see you on the other side of the break.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat.
India hands over Dornier reconnaissance aircraft to Sri Lanka. Chinese research vessel Yuan Wang 5 enters the Sea of Sri Lanka. Another generator at the Noratsole power plant breaks down. What did former president say to parliamentarians about the Aragalaya? SJB's proposal to the government. Vasudeva's explanation on the downfall of the country. Roonu Kumari derails in Busa.
Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shaukat.
And welcome back to Newsline Live. I'm joined by Zoom in Singapore, Dr. Chulanee Attanayake, who is a research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, the National University of Singapore. Thank you very much, Dr. Attanayake, for taking your time to be on Newsline. May I ask you this question? Do you see any sort of link to the supply of or the gifting of the Dornier aircraft from India to Sri Lanka? I know that this was sort of agreed way back in April, but it suddenly turned up now. What do you think?
Well, technically I do not know the details, so I cannot really say whether it has a link, but definitely there are various ways of reading about it. Sorry, excuse me. So if you look at the timing, perhaps you can also say that yes, because the ship is coming, India wants to make its claims more assertive or subtly shown, so that it decided to send this aircraft one day ahead. But on the other hand, it is also possible that it's a complete coincidence. They have already arranged this. It just happens at the same time.
Now, Sri Lanka, because of its geographic location, I suppose, are going to be, this is not the last of such requests for innocent passage, or truly innocent passage. So how does future requests look? I mean, it might not only be from China, it could be from the US, it could be Britain. Any country may send their warships around here, you know, when they're passing by, to say, look, well, let's go and pick up some coconuts and some mangoes from Sri Lanka, and if they've got it, some fuel. So how does one deal, how do you think that our foreign ministry will deal with future requests?
For us, again, this is not the first time warship has come to Sri Lanka. It's a very normal protocol in naval diplomacy for the ships to come and dock, and also like for innocent passage. If I remember correctly, in one of your sister channels, a retired admiral mentioned between 2020 and 2022, some 125 ships have docked in Sri Lankan ports. So it's just that this is a Chinese ship, and there are a lot of geopolitical aspects attached to the country that this has gained a lot of attention. So in the future also, I think we should base our policies, our decisions based on international standards. We should look at the fact whether this goes in line with international law of the sea, whether this is about rule-based order. So if we base our policies continuously on the international standards that Sri Lanka has ratified, I do not see that it will be a problem for our foreign ministry to make such decisions and to convince our partners, convince our neighbors, convince other countries that we are doing this on credible standards. But it has to continuously happen. We cannot go back and forth in our decision making. We have to show that we know what we are doing, and we have to show that we are in control. Only if we do that, our credibility also will increase.
And Dr. Chulanee Attanayake, tell me, according to a note that we saw, Sri Lanka has put forth some conditions, the Chinese vessel will be expected to keep its AIS system on and so on. But does Sri Lanka have the capability to fully monitor what's going on?
Well, I think Sri Lankan Navy has the ability to monitor in a friendly manner. And obviously, in my understanding, when such ships come, there are programs arranged between the navies. And in this case, I think it should be arranged between the scientists as well, because this is a research vessel. So when something like this happens, obviously our authorities have the ability to go and observe these things. We should look at these opportunities not only from the prism of strategic perspective. We have to also look at these opportunities on the prism of educational perspective. Sri Lanka do not have the technology or the capability at the moment to build our own research vessel of this kind. But our scientists have the ability at this point to go and observe how does it work. And if there is opportunity, we can also suggest how about we do some joint research, because Sri Lanka has huge ocean resource that has not been tapped. And we talk about blue economy, but we do not. I don't think we have full understanding what lies beneath the ocean. So for that, we need the research capabilities, and we should look at these opportunities in that sense as well.
And I'm told by my sources in the maritime world that Sri Lanka doesn't have sonar radar capabilities. They have it above water, but not underwater. So that's one thing that's lacking. But touching on your point about Sri Lanka and its vast potential in terms of maritime affairs, link that with our dollar crisis right now. Would you say that it's a fair statement to say that Sri Lanka's victory lies in the Sea of Sri Lanka and its maritime capability? Is that where our real income source and stream can be?
It is one of the major income sources for the country because, as I said, I don't think Sri Lanka is fully aware of our potential in the ocean resources. We need to do more research and understand and try to exploit. I know that we have been talking about blue economy for a longer period of time, but in reality, I think we have not taken enough practical steps to reach there. So given Sri Lanka's current economic crisis and given the fact that we are talking about change and also reset, this is one area we can seriously look at to see how we can use the ocean resources for Sri Lanka's future economic development.
Would you, as a person with your roots in Sri Lanka, would you sort of bemoan the fact that Sri Lanka's foreign service has been sort of, shall we say, meddled with, and don't want to go down that route, but would you sort of bemoan the fact that if Sri Lanka had career foreign office people, career diplomats, that they perhaps may have been able to handle this whole business without it ending up on the front pages of all the newspapers and the primetime news?
Well, to a certain extent, I cannot say no to that. Sri Lanka has been lacking that foreign service for a longer period of time, and we have seen the repercussions time and time again. There are things that diplomats know how to handle publicly and also behind the door. It's a different art, it's a different capability, and that's why they are trained for. So I think it's very important for any country to put their best foreign service forward, whether it is in times of crisis or whether it's during the best times. They are the face of the country and they know how to handle any situation.
So, thank you. And of course, Sri Lanka has several retired admirals and so on that the Foreign Office could well make use of. And we hope that after all the Aragalia protests and so on, that the public have conveyed a real message to our lawmakers that Sri Lanka needs to act in the best interests of its people, who are, after all, sovereign. Dr. Attanayake, do you think there will be a time when Sri Lanka can really focus and get back to the heydays of non-alignment, especially under Mrs. Bandaranaike? If you remember, as history will tell us, how Mrs. Bandaranaike resolved a request from Pakistan to sort of fly their aircraft at the end of the Indo-Pak War via Sri Lanka and refuel here and go on to Pakistan. And she did that on the basis, of course, of the advice she received, and it was pointed out that since the hostilities had finished, this was innocent passage. But she took that stance, and the Pakistanis have never quite forgotten that support. Do you think there's a genuine possibility that Sri Lanka will head back to its heydays of non-alignment?
I think we should make that effort genuinely. For a small country, I always reiterate the best option of foreign policy is to be non-aligned, to be neutral. And that can only be achieved when you deeply look into the country's interest and find that art of navigating the balance between competitive powers. It's true that the world is seeing a strategic competition of this kind for the first, I would perhaps not the first time in the history, but definitely it's a unique kind of strategic competition. But of course, Sri Lanka is not the only country that is being caught in this strategic competition. We can look at Southeast Asia and see how those countries are navigating this. There are other similar examples in the history, say Switzerland or Finland. We can look at those examples and we can learn from them. History is the best teacher, in my opinion, when it comes to these kind of issues. And we always say history always repeat. So if history is going to repeat, I think the answers are also in the history. So it's up to us to go and search for those answers and implement the best strategies for the country. So in my opinion, it might seem difficult. There are no shortcuts, but definitely we have to make that genuine effort to become neutral and non-aligned as much as possible.
Having joined us by Zoom, live from Singapore, Dr. Chulanee Attanayake, we very much appreciate your time on Newsline Live. Thank you. And,
thank you, Faraz.
Thank you. And it's now time for the primetime news with the Newsfirst team there. And not before, of course, I say to you, have a very good evening, and as always, God bless you all.